In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the overview of rules related to dependents and claiming dependents on a tax return. Generally, claiming dependents is a fairly straightforward thing, so we want to have the normal rules down. However, we want to learn it in some order, and there are times when it can be more complicated to think about the qualifications for a dependent. Therefore, what's our strategy with relation to understanding dependents and who qualifies for the dependents? One, we want to know the general rules. We'll outline the general outline of rules we should have in our head. In those straightforward types of cases, we know exactly what to do within the straightforward types of cases. Then when we have some more complexity, we want to research those more complex situations. When we have the general rules in our head, then we can pinpoint where we want to expand on those general rules, where we want to do that research. And we can research, of course, starting out at the IRS website at irs.gov, irs.gov. One place to start are the instructions for the Form 1040, which will have a questionnaire that is often helpful. Now, what is the importance of dependents? Note that we don't get the exemption anymore. So that was something that changed last year. When you say, well, why would you want a dependent? What's the benefit for tax purposes of a dependent? It used to be, well, one of the major things is you got an exemption for it, which is kind of like a deduction. Now, no exemption. However, dependents still important. What are the major things that we're going to change or that could have an impact with regards to dependents? Could have an impact on the child tax credit, could have an impact on the credit for other dependents, could have an impact on the earned income credit, and it could have an impact on filing status if we're going to, especially when we're thinking about head of household versus single. So it's still relevant. It's quite relevant. Depending on the situation, different things will be impacted with regards to the dependents. So it's typically a good thing to have the dependents. Where are the dependents going to be reported on the Form 1040? They're going to be down here. This is page 1 of the 1040. That's where the dependents will actually be shown. What type of things will be affected by the dependents? Well, on page 2 of the 1040, if there's a child tax credit, that's one thing that could be affected, the child being a dependent. And then we have the refundable portions down here of the child tax credit or earned income credit. The way you want to think about dependents is if we have a dependent, there's two categories you want to group the dependents in, either a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. Those are going to be the typical two types of groups we're going to be grouping the dependents into. So when you're questioning about dependents, your first question is, does this individual qualify as a qualifying child? If not, then you go to the qualifying relative. So is this person a dependent? If so, first, are they a qualifying child? We check that first. Then if not, then we go to the qualifying relative and see if they can get the qualification there. Dependents must meet 3 general tests. So whether they are a qualifying child or qualifying relative, they would need to meet these tests. Those include the dependent taxpayer test, the joint return test, and the citizen or resident test. The dependent taxpayer test is, if person in question is claimed by another, the taxpayer cannot claim this person as a dependent. So in other words, one person can't be claimed as a dependent on multiple different tax returns. Now, you could have a question as to whether who qualifies for being able to claim that dependent. And if that's in question, you can get into more detail as to who has the right to basically claim someone as a dependent. The IRS, of course, would like to and is trying to make the rules so that only one person qualifies to be a dependent. But in the case where there's a divorce situation, then you have the question of who's going to be able to claim the dependent. You can't have 2 individuals claiming the dependent. So if the dependent's claimed somewhere else, general rule, you can't have it claimed on another return as well. And then there's going to have to be a debate as to where that dependent should be claimed or who has the right to claim the dependent. Joint return test. Person claimed as a dependent cannot file a married filing joint tax return. So general rule, if someone is a dependent, they're not typically married, is the idea behind this rule. So if someone files a married filing joint return, then the general rule would be that they could not be claimed as a dependent on somebody else's return. So for example, if we had a parent and they had a child, but that child is filing a joint return as married, then you would think generally that they would not be claimed as a dependent of the parent. But there's an exception unless there's no tax liability on the return. So if there could be a situation of exception there, you want to get more research on that if you find that situation. citizen or resident test. That would be the U.S. citizen, resident or national, resident of Canada or Mexico, adopted child of the taxpayer if the child is a member of the taxpayer's household all year and the taxpayer is a U.S. citizen or national. So now we're going to think about the qualifying child. So these are going to be the general tests, the 3 general tests for a dependent in general, whether qualifying child or the qualifying relative. Now we're going to be going to the qualifying child, which has 5 tests. 5 tests for a qualifying child. This would be the preferred way to go, the qualifying child, as opposed to a qualifying relative. You have the relationship test, an age test, a residency test, a support test, a test for qualifying child of more than one taxpayer. So note, these first 4 are the general tests you would have: relationship, age, residency, support. And then in that situation where you might have like a divorce or some situation where the dependent may be qualifiable possibly for multiple individual, again, you're going to have that situation where you have to figure out where that dependent will be claimed. Taxpayer only allows one tax return to be claiming a dependent. So in more detail, a relationship test is your son, daughter, adopted child, stepchild, foster child, or a descendant of any of them, such as your grandchild, brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or a descendant of any of them, such as a niece or nephew. Then we have the age test. The age test, at the end of the filing year, your child was younger than you, your spouse, if you file a joint return, and younger than 19. So the general rule, you're going to think 19 is kind of the key number there, typically not younger than the 19. At the end of the filing year, your child was younger than you, and that would be a kind of an unusual situation where the child will be older than you, but that will put, or your spouse, if you file a joint return, younger than 24 and a full-time student. So general rule, 19, younger than 19. However, if they're a full-time student, then they can pass the age test up to 24. So typically, if they're talking about someone that's going to college, that would be the exception on the 24. At the end of the filing year, your child was any age and permanently or totally disabled. So you have an exception to the rule. If permanently or totally disabled, then they would pass the age test at any age. Then we have the residency test. So the residence test. Child must live with you or your spouse if you file a joint return in the United States for more than half the year. So more than half the year, residence test. Then the support test. The child cannot provide more than half his or her own support. So notice we don't have a gross income kind of limitation here. We have this basically general rule. The child cannot provide more than half his or her own support. Now, if someone doesn't qualify as a qualifying child, the next question is, well, do they qualify for a qualifying relative? We have 4 tests for a qualifying relative. First test, not a qualifying child, because obviously if they qualify as a qualifying child, they will be a qualifying child. That's why we go through that test. Well, that's one reason we go through that test first. You always want to think about qualifying child first. A relationship or member of the household, gross income test, which is less than $4,200. So that's a more restrictive type of test here. We didn't have that basically income test with a qualifying child, fairly low gross income with the $4,200 to qualify for the qualifying relative. Then we have the support test, which is more than half the year. A little bit more detail on the relationship or member of the household. So we have live with you the entire year, that's 365 days, or be one of these: your child, stepchild, foster child, or a descendant of any of them, your brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, or stepsister, or a descendant of any of them, your father, mother, grandparent, or step-parent, but not a foster parent, your son-in-law, daughter-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, your uncle, aunt, nephew, or niece.